Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
Delivering disaster assistance at scale is one of FEMA's toughest operational challenges. A GAO review looks at where the system struggles to match survivor needs after major disasters. And Chris Currie, director in the Homeland Security and Justice team at GAO, is here to walk us through the details. Chris, welcome back to the show. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me again.
Well, we're coming into hurricane season and fire season, so this certainly is timely. Based on your review, how well does FEMA's disaster assistance system match the actual needs of survivors after a major disaster event?
Yeah, so what we've been trying to do is issue quick, short reports to detail, where FEMA is in its reform efforts, particularly over the last year when there's been a lot of changes in the agency. First report we did last fall was looking at FEMA's workforce and the workforce reductions. The second one that we did, which came out earlier this year, was looking at state and local preparedness and how ready they are to absorb more disaster response and recovery responsibilities. And then this most recent report is looking at FEMA assistance to individuals, because most assistance that goes directly to individual citizens actually comes from the federal government and FEMA after a disaster. So if state and locals are going to be doing more, we thought it was important to look at what they're going to have to do in the future for everyday people.
Well, we're coming into hurricane season and fire season, so this certainly is timely. Based on your review, how well does FEMA's disaster assistance system match the actual needs of survivors after a major disaster event?
Well, can I just say, first of all, we got really lucky last year in the country because we did not have a large landfalling hurricane or multiple concurrent large landfalling hurricanes, which happens quite a lot. I think that might have lulled us to sleep a little bit, to think that there hasn't been many changes in FEMA's operating posture. Things are looking pretty good. That could not be further from the truth, because, if we get another situation like we had in 2024 with Helene, Hurricane Helene, then we're going to be in a much different situation. But the bottom line is that the major challenge with FEMA's assistance to individuals is that it's a system that requires the individual citizen to work really hard to extract the resources and the help from FEMA. It's not a customer-centric system. It's not designed to help the individual survivor coordinate and get the most assistance they can as quickly as it can. And it's not that was done on purpose. These programs were developed over time to help people, and FEMA's goal is to help people, and there's dedicated people there trying to do that every day. The problem is, over time, you have multiple programs, a lot of regulations, a lot of red tape, a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of process put in place to safeguard dollars and to ensure the integrity of the program. But what that's built up to cumulatively is that it's very frustrating and very difficult for people to get help.
Well, and you're meeting people at a point where they are desperate and may not have all of their file folders and all of their records at hand to answer some questions. What were some of the biggest obstacles that you found that these survivors face?
I want people to put themselves in the shoes of a survivor. So if you've ever dealt with an insurance claim or a difficult customer service problem, just multiply that by like 50, right? If your house is destroyed and you have no belongings, you have no internet, you have no power, and you're still trying to work and send your kids to school and things like that. So let me just give you some examples of what we saw. Let's start with just getting the help. Let's start with call centers. When people call FEMA to get help, or maybe they register online and they're calling FEMA to get questions answered, or they're not clear about something in their registration. We found that a lot of those calls during busy times aren't answered, or if they are answered, they're answered after multiple hours of waiting. And that's if a person doesn't give up and just hang up. So what that does is, first of all, it means that a person maybe doesn't register, they don't get their question answered, or maybe they just assume they're not going to get the help and they give up. So what we don't know is who doesn't continue the process after that type of frustrating situation. That's really difficult to quantify. So another example is how FEMA communicates what they're going to provide to a survivor. So they do this through pretty formal letters to a survivor, which are emailed or sent hard copy. And it basically says, you have applied for disaster assistance. this is what we can do for you, or this is what we can't do for you. But in a lot of cases, a survivor, the letter might say, you are denied assistance, or we cannot provide you assistance. And it's not that they're not eligible, it's just that something has to happen first. For example, they need to go through their insurance company first. They need to provide proof that they've gone through their insurance company first. But a lot of people see these letters from the federal government and they say, oh, I'm denied, or I'm not I'm not eligible for assistance. And so they don't continue the process. I mean, these are intimidating processes, and, people don't necessarily continue to try to get the help they need. And it's very frustrating to people. That's what leads to this sense that FEMA says it's there, but when it comes down to it, they don't really provide much help.
Chris Currie is a director in the Homeland Security and Justice team at GAO. Chris, FEMA was affected by a number of funding lapses in the last 12 months. What kind of impact is that having on what's already a really complex system?
It's terrible. I mean, it's just more and more fuel on top of a fire. So over the last year and a half, FEMA's been under a hiring freeze. They've been downsized by about between 3,000 to 4,000 people. They've lost a tremendous number of experienced leaders through deferred resignations and deferred retirements, and all these programs to try to reduce the organization. So morale of the staff, I think, it was already low. Then when you add on that 2 shutdowns over the last year, the most recent one, the longest shutdown in history, a lot of those people were still having to work during that time and not being paid. So, what we hear from the staff and what we hear from state and locals that work with them is that, it's just very difficult to focus on the mission when you don't know if you're going to have a job or you're fearful to make a decision. It's just a very difficult and toxic situation.
Well, let's put the 3 reports together. You looked at state and local capacity, you looked at FEMA's workforce, and now you're looking sort of at the processes around disaster response. What's the bottom line here? What should survivors expect, and what can we do to try to fix the system?
The bottom line is that FEMA provides a ton of assistance to state and local communities and to survivors after disasters. And while there's frustration with process, nobody disagrees that help is critical, and recovery would not be possible without FEMA's help. I think what is being discussed now nationally is how to provide that assistance and who should provide it. Would the state and local government be better suited, being closer to the community or the survivor, to provide that help? Nobody thinks that the federal government shouldn't provide the dollars, though, because state and local governments, they're not fiscally prepared to handle that. FEMA's spent almost $400 billion over the last 8 to 9 years on disaster assistance. State and local governments cannot fund that. The other thing that's the key takeaway is if the process for responding to disaster is going to change and state and locals are going to do more, then that has to be done over time and has to be done gradually. State and local governments have to build up their capacity and their resources to do this and allow time to adjust to any changes. This can't just be done overnight, because that's going to create a very bad situation when we get a big catastrophic disaster.
The FEMA Review Council has finally put out its final set of recommendations for FEMA. Some of the worst hypotheses maybe didn't come to fruition, but there's still plenty in there for change. Many of those changes would require congressional action. There's also pending legislation on the Hill about creating a separate cabinet agency out of FEMA. What does Congress need to do to address some of the issues that you've just laid out?
Well, first of all, you're absolutely right. The council's report, I thought, was very thorough and actually suggested changes that align with many of the things we've recommended over the years. So, for example, what I just said earlier, making disaster assistance more accessible to survivors and less frustrating. Reducing the fragmentation and the administrative bureaucracy behind recovery programs that take often decades to implement and billions of dollars are spent. So those are things that we have advocated for over the years and we've recommended, and I think they're a good idea. I was happy to see the final report walk back some of the more drastic rhetoric about cutting FEMA in half. See, the problem, Terry, is that those statements were thrown out there without any assessment done of what the workforce need was. It was just, let's cut by 50%. Well, why? And what's the mission of FEMA? And how do you know how many people you need? That work has not been done. So, you can't make those decisions willy-nilly until you've actually done the work and seen how many people they actually need. So the other thing that's important, and you said it, is this is a council report. This is not a law. This is not an executive order. This is not a regulatory change. Nothing has changed now going into hurricane season. So in the short term, FEMA still has to do what it has to do to respond to disasters coming up in the future. And it will require regulation, legislation, and executive action. And some of these things, so this is going to take years to implement. I think probably 2 to 5 years to probably implement the reforms we're going to see here. And, until that happens, we need a strong and effective FEMA to be ready to respond to disasters, because we can't just make these changes overnight.
Chris Currie is director in the Homeland Security and Justice team at GAO. Chris, thanks so much for sharing this report. Thanks for the great work you're doing on this really important topic.
Thank you.
We'll post this interview and a link to the report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.